The air inside the Cotton Club that night was thick with cigar smoke and jazz. The kind of night where everyone felt untouchable, where whiskey flowed like water and laughter echoed off the velvet walls. But in the corner booth, past the dancers and the drunks, past the tables where mobsters played cards and politicians shook hands with criminals, something was happening that would change the temperature of Harlem forever. 3 men sat around a table, leaning back in their chairs like kings. Their voices were loud, too loud, and the name they kept repeating, louder each time, was Bumpy Johnson. They were not whispering it in fear. They were not saying it with respect. They were mocking it, laughing at it, spitting it out like a punchline to a joke only they understood. One of them, a man named Vincent Russo, slammed his glass down hard enough to turn heads. He grinned, his gold tooth catching the dim light. He said Bumpy's name again, this time with a curse attached to it. The table erupted in laughter. Across the room, near the bar, a man in a grey suit stood perfectly still. He did not laugh. He did not move. He simply watched. His name was not spoken aloud that night, but everyone who mattered knew who he was. By sunrise, Vincent Russo would be gone. So would the 2 men laughing beside him. And Harlem would remember why you never, ever, mocked Bumpy Johnson in public. Harlem in 1952 was not just a neighborhood, it was a kingdom, and like all kingdoms, it had rules. Unspoken but absolute. You could run numbers, you could move product, you could even challenge territory if you were smart and connected enough. But there was one rule that stood above all others. You did not disrespect the man who held the streets together. Bumpy Johnson was not a loud man. He did not need to be. His reputation moved through Harlem like a shadow, quiet and everywhere at once. He had survived wars with the Italian mob. He had done time upstate and come back stronger. He had built alliances that stretched from Sugar Hill to the docks, from the policy banks to the after-hours clubs, where the real power in Harlem was brokered over bourbon and backroom deals. He was respected, feared, and for good reason. But respect is a fragile thing. It must be maintained. And the moment it is questioned, the moment someone believes they can chip away at it without consequence, the entire structure begins to crack. That night at the Cotton Club, the crack began. Vincent Russo was not from Harlem. He was a middleman, a fixer who worked between the Italian syndicates in lower Manhattan and the black operators uptown. He moved money, he brokered deals, and because of that, he believed he was untouchable, protected by both sides, a necessary piece. He had grown comfortable, too comfortable. The 2 men with him were locals, small-time hustlers who had recently aligned themselves with a crew out of the Bronx. They were young, hungry, and foolish enough to believe that aligning with outside money made them immune to local consequences. Their names were Marcus, Clean, Avery, and Lionel Turner. Marcus was a sharp dresser, always in tailored suits he could not quite afford. Lionel was Muscle, a former boxer who had taken too many hits and now solved problems with his fists instead of his brain. Together, the 3 of them sat in that booth and made a decision that would seal their fate. They decided that Bumpy Johnson was old news, that his time had passed, that the new generation, the ones willing to work with the Italians, the ones who did not care about pride or territory or legacy, were the future. And they said it out loud, in public, in a place where ears were everywhere and loyalty was currency. What they did not know was that one of the waiters clearing glasses 2 tables over was on Bumpy's payroll. What they did not know was that the bartender who poured their drinks had a cousin who ran numbers for Bumpy's operation. What they did not know was that in Harlem, words traveled faster than bullets. And by the time they stumbled out of the Cotton Club that night, laughing and drunk, and convinced of their own cleverness, the message had already been delivered. Bumpy Johnson knew. Bumpy Johnson did not react the way most men would. There was no explosion of rage, no immediate phone call to his enforcers, no public declaration of war. Instead, he sat in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, a glass of cognac in his hand, and he thought. He had learned long ago that anger was a tool, and like any tool, it was only useful when applied with precision. Rage made men sloppy, it made them visible, It made them predictable, and Bumpy had not survived this long by being any of those things. He was in his late 40s now, though he carried himself like a man 10 years younger. His hair was beginning to grey at the temples, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He wore expensive suits, but not flashy ones. He moved through Harlem like a businessman, not a gangster, and that was exactly the point. Bumpy understood something that most men in his line of work did not. Power was not about being the loudest or the most violent. It was about being inevitable. It was about creating a reality where your enemies had no moves left before they even realized the game had started. He had learned that in prison. He had learned it from watching men bigger and meaner than him destroy themselves through impatience. He had learned it from the old-timers who told him that the streets respected fear, but they remembered strategy. And so he sat and he planned. Across town, Vincent Russo was still laughing. He had returned to his small apartment in Midtown, a place he kept separate from his Harlem dealings. He poured himself another drink and replayed the night in his mind. He thought about how good it felt to say what everyone was supposedly thinking, that Bumpy was a relic, that the old guard was dying, that men like him, men who could move between worlds, were the future. He did not know that his name was already on a list. He did not know that the phone in Bumpy's apartment had rung 3 times since midnight, each call brief, each one a piece of a puzzle being assembled in real time. Marcus Clean Avery had gone home to his girl, a singer at the Apollo who did not ask questions about where his money came from. He kissed her on the forehead and told her he was moving up in the world, that he was done being small-time, that within 6 months he would have his own crew, his own territory, his own name. She smiled. She told him she believed in him, and she fell asleep with her head on his chest, unaware that the man she loved had just made the worst mistake of his life. Lionel Turner did not go home. He went to a card game in a basement off Lenox Avenue, a place where men played poker until dawn and settled debts with more than money. He was loud there too. He told the table about the night, about how they had put Bumpy in his place, about how the old man was finished. One of the players, a quiet man in a newsboy cap, said nothing. He simply folded his hand, excused himself, and left through the back door. By the time Lionel won his next hand, the message had already traveled 4 blocks. Bumpy now had eyes on all 3 of them. But he still did not move, not yet. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something that Vincent, Marcus, and Lionel did not. Revenge was not about speed. It was about certainty. It was about making sure that when you acted, the message was so clear, so absolute, that no one would ever make the same mistake again. And for that, you needed patience. 2 days passed, 48 hours in which the 3 men went about their lives, unaware that the clock had already started counting down, unaware that every conversation, every movement, every decision they made was being watched. Vincent Russo met with a contact from the Genovese family at a diner on 42nd Street. They discussed a shipment coming in through Newark. They discussed percentages. They discussed expansion into Harlem. And when Vincent mentioned that the old power structure was breaking down, that Bumpy Johnson was losing his grip, the contact smiled politely and said nothing. But he remembered. Marcus Clean Avery went to his tailor, ordered 2 new suits, and paid in cash. He told the tailor he was celebrating, that things were changing for him, that he was about to step into a bigger world. The tailor, an older man who had been pressing suits in Harlem for 30 years, nodded and smiled. But he too remembered. Lionel Turner spent his days at a gym on 125th Street, training younger fighters and collecting debts for a loan shark who operated out of a barbershop. He was loud there too. He told stories. He bragged. He made sure everyone knew he was not afraid of anyone. And everyone who heard him made a mental note. But the incident that sealed everything, the moment that turned rumor into action, happened on the 3rd night. Vincent Russo, emboldened by the lack of response, made another appearance at the Cotton Club. This time, he was not just mocking Bumpy in private conversation. He was performing. He stood near the bar, drink in hand, and told a story to a small crowd. a story about how Bumpy Johnson used to be somebody, how the old man was now just a name people said out of habit, not respect. He said it loud enough for half the club to hear. And this time, one of Bumpy's closest allies, a man named Junie Byard, was sitting 3 tables away. Junie was not a fighter, he was not an enforcer, he was a fixer, a strategist, a man who had been with Bumpy since the early days. He was the kind of man who remembered everything and said very little. And when he heard Vincent Russo mock Bumpy Johnson for the second time in public, he did not react. He simply stood, placed a few bills on the table, and walked out. He did not go home, he went to Edgecombe Avenue. Bumpy was awake, he was always awake. Junie sat down across from him and recounted the night, every word, every laugh, every face in the crowd that had heard it. When he finished, Bumpy nodded slowly. He did not speak for a long time. He simply looked out the window at the lights of Harlem, at the streets he had spent his entire life protecting, managing, and controlling. Then he said 4 words. "It is time." What happened next was not loud, it was not visible. To the untrained eye, nothing changed. The streets continued to hum, the clubs stayed open, the numbers runners made their rounds, but underneath the surface, something had shifted. Bumpy made 3 phone calls that night, each one brief, each one coded in language that only the recipient would understand. The first call went to a man who managed the flow of policy slips in East Harlem. The second went to a driver who worked the late-night routes between Harlem and the Bronx. The third went to a woman who ran a boarding house on 132nd Street, a place where information was traded like currency. By morning, the machinery was in motion. Vincent Russo woke up to find that his usual contact at the docks had stopped returning his calls. The shipment he was supposed to broker, the one that would have earned him a $5,000 cut, was suddenly delayed. No explanation, no apology, just silence. He made more calls, he pressed his connections, but everywhere he turned, he found doors that had been open yesterday now quietly closed. He did not understand why, not yet. Marcus Clean Avery walked into his regular barbershop and found the owner suddenly cold. The man who usually greeted him with a handshake and a smile now barely looked at him. When Marcus asked what was wrong, the barber shrugged and said business was slow. He did not offer Marcus his usual chair. He did not ask about his week. Marcus left confused, uneasy, but not yet afraid. Lionel Turner showed up at the gym and found the younger fighters avoiding him. The loan shark he worked for told him to take a few days off. No reason given, just a suggestion. Lionel pushed back, asked questions, but the loan shark, a man who usually respected Lionel's presence, simply repeated himself. "Take a few days off." Lionel left angry, but also unsettled. None of them connected the dots. Not yet. They each assumed it was coincidence, bad luck, a rough patch. But in Harlem, there was no such thing as coincidence. Every slight, every cold shoulder, every closed door was a message. And the message was being delivered with surgical precision. Bumpy did not need to touch them, not yet. He simply needed them to feel the walls closing in, to sense that something had changed, to begin questioning their own decisions. Isolation was a weapon, and Bumpy wielded it like a master. Junie Byard moved through the streets like a ghost, speaking quietly to the right people. He did not issue threats. He did not mention Bumpy's name. He simply reminded certain individuals of where their loyalties should lie, of who had protected them when times were hard, of who had built the structure that allowed them to eat. And one by one, those individuals made their choices. Vincent Russo's phone stopped ringing. Marcus Clean Avery found his credit drying up at the card games. Lionel Turner walked into his favorite bar and found the bartender suddenly out of his preferred drink. Small things, subtle things, but together they created a suffocating pressure. By the end of the week, all 3 men were on edge. They began to suspect something was wrong, but they did not know what. They had no proof, no concrete evidence, just a growing sense of dread. And then, on the 8th night, the pressure increased. Vincent received a visit at his apartment, not from Bumpy, Not from anyone he recognized, just a young man, barely 20, who knocked on his door and handed him an envelope. Inside was a single sentence, typed on a blank piece of paper. "You talked too much." No signature, no threat, just a statement of fact. Vincent's hands shook as he read it. He looked up, but the young man was already gone. Marcus found a similar note slipped under his door the same night. His said, "You chose the wrong side." Lionel's note was even simpler. "Your name is known." None of them slept that night. And Bumpy Johnson, sitting in his apartment with a glass of cognac and a faint smile, knew that the fear had finally taken root. Now it was time to finish it. The turning point came on a Tuesday, the kind of grey, overcast morning where Harlem felt smaller, quieter, like the city itself was holding its breath. Vincent Russo made a decision. He would leave, not forever, just long enough for things to cool down. He packed a bag, told his contacts he was taking a trip to Philadelphia, and arranged for a car to pick him up at noon. He did not know that the driver worked for Bumpy. Marcus Clean Avery decided to reach out directly, to find a mutual contact who could broker a conversation, to apologize if necessary, to make things right. He was not a coward, but he was not stupid either. He knew when he had miscalculated. He sent word through a runner that he wanted to meet, to talk, to explain. The runner never came back. Lionel Turner, ever the fighter, decided to push back, to stand his ground, to show that he was not afraid. He went to the gym, trained harder than usual, and made sure people saw him, made sure they knew he was not hiding. But when he left that night, he noticed something. The streets were emptier than usual. The usual faces were gone. The corners that were always occupied now stood vacant. He walked faster. His instincts, honed from years of fighting, told him something was wrong. He was right. By midnight, all three men had made their moves, and all three moves had been anticipated. Vincent Russo climbed into the back of the car that was supposed to take him to Philadelphia. The driver, a calm man in his 30s, pulled away from the curb and drove south. They made it 6 blocks before the car turned down a side street that was not on the route. Vincent noticed. He leaned forward. He asked where they were going. The driver did not answer. Vincent reached for the door handle. It did not open. The locks had been removed. The car stopped in an alley off Lenox Avenue. 2 men were waiting. Vincent recognized neither of them, but he understood immediately. He tried to talk, tried to negotiate, tried to explain that he had connections, that people would notice if he disappeared, that this was a mistake. The 2 men did not speak. They simply opened the door and gestured for him to get out. Vincent hesitated, then he ran. He made it 12 feet before they caught him. Marcus Clean Avery was at his apartment when the knock came. He thought it was the runner returning. He thought it was the conversation he had requested. He opened the door with hope in his eyes. It was not hope that greeted him. 3 men stepped inside. One of them closed the door behind them. Marcus backed up, hands raised, explaining that this was not necessary, that he understood his mistake, that he wanted to make it right. One of the men, the tallest, shook his head slowly. Too late for that. Marcus tried to fight. He was not a fighter, but desperation gave him energy. He swung wildly, connected once, and then was overwhelmed. They did not beat him. They did not need to. They simply restrained him, covered his mouth, and carried him out the back entrance where a truck was waiting. His girl, the singer from the Apollo, was out that night. She would come home to an empty apartment and assume he had left in a hurry. It would be 3 days before she realized he was not coming back. Lionel Turner saw them coming. His fighter's instincts kicked in the moment he turned the corner and saw the 2 figures waiting in the shadows. He did not hesitate. He turned and ran the other direction. But Harlem was a maze if you did not know it, and the men chasing Lionel had been walking these streets their entire lives. He made it 4 blocks. He ducked into an alley, climbed a fire escape, tried to disappear into the rooftops. But when he reached the top, he found 2 more men waiting. He was trapped. Lionel did what he always did. He fought. He swung hard, landed a few punches, bloodied one man's nose, but there were too many, and they were not there to box. They were there to finish a job. He went down swinging, and when the struggle ended, the rooftop was silent. By sunrise, all 3 men were gone. No bodies were found, no police reports were filed, no witnesses came forward. It was as if Vincent Russo, Marcus, Clean Avery, and Lionel Turner had simply vanished into the Harlem night. And in a way, they had. The disappearance did not go unnoticed. Within 24 hours, questions began to circulate. Friends asked, associates wondered. The Italian contacts that Vincent had worked with started making inquiries. But every inquiry hit the same wall: silence. The Genovese family sent a representative to Harlem to ask around. He met with a few of the older operators, men who still did business with both sides. He asked if anyone had seen Vincent, if anyone knew what happened. The answers were all the same. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The representative was not stupid. He knew what silence meant, but he also knew that pressing the issue without proof would start a war that no one wanted. So he reported back that Vincent Russo had likely skipped town, that he had probably run off with money he owed, that it was an internal issue, not a territorial one. The family accepted the explanation, publicly. But privately, they noted the message. They understood that something had shifted in Harlem, that Bumpy Johnson was still very much in control, and that disrespecting him, even indirectly, carried consequences. Marcus's crew, the young hustlers from the Bronx he had aligned with, also asked questions. They sent people into Harlem to dig around, but those people came back with nothing. Or worse, they came back and advised their bosses to drop it. One of them, a mid-level operator named Ricky Shaw, returned from Harlem visibly shaken. When his boss asked what he had learned, Ricky simply said, "We should stay out of Harlem." His boss pressed him, demanded details. Ricky shook his head. "I am telling you, we should stay out of Harlem." The boss, frustrated but not foolish, took the advice. Lionel's loan shark employer also made inquiries, but he did so carefully. He knew Lionel had been loud. He knew Lionel had made mistakes, and he also knew that in Harlem, mistakes like that were often fatal. When he asked Junie Byard, casually, over drinks, if he had heard anything about Lionel, Junie had smiled politely and said he had not. The loan shark did not ask again. Because in Harlem, silence was an answer. The streets absorbed the disappearance the way water absorbs blood, quickly, quietly, without a trace. And life went on. The numbers runners kept running, the clubs kept playing music, the card games continued, but underneath it all, everyone understood what had happened. Everyone knew the message that had been sent. Bumpy Johnson had reminded Harlem of the rules. And the rules were absolute. But Bumpy did not stop there, because sending a message was only half the equation. The other half was ensuring that the message was never forgotten. Over the next 2 weeks, Bumpy moved through Harlem with a visibility he had not shown in months. He attended church on Sunday. He had dinner at Red Rooster. He stopped by the barbershops and the policy banks, shaking hands, asking about families, showing his face. He did not mention Vincent, Marcus, or Lionel. He did not need to. His presence alone was the reminder. And with every handshake, every conversation, every quiet moment where his eyes met someone else's and an understanding passed between them, the structure of Harlem was reinforced. Loyalty was rewarded, disrespect was punished, and the man who held it all together was still very much in power. Junie Byard, ever the strategist, used the moment to consolidate alliances. He met with operators who had been on the fence, who had been considering outside offers, who had been tempted by the idea that the old guard was fatting. He did not threaten them, he simply reminded them of what had just happened, of how quickly things could change, of how important it was to be on the right side. And one by one, they recommitted. By the end of the month, Bumpy's position was stronger than it had been in years. The Italian families respected the boundary. The younger crews understood the cost of disrespect. And the streets of Harlem, from Sugar Hill to the docks, were unified under a single, unspoken understanding. Bumpy Johnson was not a relic. He was not fading. He was inevitable. And anyone who forgot that would vanish before sunrise. 6 weeks after the disappearance, a man named Thomas Collier walked into the Red Rooster and asked to speak with Bumpy Johnson. Thomas was not from Harlem. He was a lawyer from downtown, well-dressed, well-spoken, and well-connected. He represented a group of investors who were interested in expanding into Harlem's entertainment and real estate sectors. Legitimate businesses, he said, legal money. But everyone knew that legitimate business in Harlem still required permission. Thomas was escorted to a private booth in the back where Bumpy sat with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. Bumpy did not stand. He did not offer his hand. He simply looked up and waited. Thomas sat down. He introduced himself. He laid out his pitch. New clubs, new housing developments, partnerships with the city, a way to bring money into Harlem that would benefit everyone. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, Bumpy folded his newspaper and set it aside. "Who sent you?" Thomas hesitated. Then he named a development company, a real one. But Bumpy knew, as everyone in that room knew, that real companies did not send lawyers into Harlem without first talking to the people who ran it. "Who really sent you?" Thomas shifted in his seat. He was smart enough to know that lying would end the conversation, so he told the truth. A group of investors, some Italian, some Jewish, some local businessmen who wanted to capitalize on Harlem's growth. Bumpy nodded slowly, and they thought they could come into my neighborhood without speaking to me first. It was not a question. Thomas, to his credit, did not try to spin it. They thought the landscape had changed, that new opportunities meant new players. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 3 men thought the same thing recently. Do you know where they are now? Thomas's face went pale. He had heard the rumors. Everyone downtown had heard the rumors. "I am not here to disrespect you, Mr. Johnson. I am here to offer a partnership." "No," Bumpy said calmly. "You are here to test me, to see if the stories are true, to see if I am still the man people say I am." Thomas started to protest, but Bumpy raised a hand. "Go back to your investors. Tell them that Harlem is not for sale. Tell them that any business they want to do here goes through me. And tell them that if they send another lawyer to ask me questions they already know the answers to, I will not be this polite." Thomas swallowed hard. He nodded. He stood, gathered his briefcase, and left without another word. Bumpy watched him go. Then he picked up his newspaper and continued reading. Junie Byard, who had been sitting at the bar, walked over and sat down across from him. "You think they will try again?" Bumpy did not look up from his paper. "They will think about it, but they will not try." "How can you be sure?" Bumpy finally looked up. His eyes were calm, cold, certain. "Because I just reminded them what happens when you underestimate me." Junie smiled. "You think word will spread?" "It already has." And he was right. By that evening, Thomas Collier had reported back to his investors. By the next morning, the development plans for Harlem had been quietly shelved. And by the end of the week, every major operator in New York, from the Italians to the Irish to the independent crews, had received the same message. Bumpy Johnson was not negotiating, he was not compromising, and he was not going anywhere. The confrontation was over before it ever truly began. Because Bumpy had learned long ago that the best battles were the ones you never had to fight, the ones where your reputation did the work for you. And his reputation, forged in the disappearance of 3 men who had mocked him in public, was now unshakable. In the months that followed, Harlem experienced a period of stability that surprised even the most seasoned observers. The usual conflicts, the territorial disputes, the small skirmishes over corners and card games all seemed to quiet down. It was not peace, it was alignment. Bumpy had reminded everyone of the cost of chaos, and in doing so, he had created an environment where cooperation was not just smart, it was necessary. The policy banks ran smoother, the clubs operated without incident, the younger crews, the ones who had been ambitious and reckless, now moved with caution. They asked permission, they showed respect, they understood that ambition without discipline was a death sentence. Vincent Russo's name was never mentioned again, not in the clubs, not in the back rooms, not even in whispers. It was as if he had never existed. Marcus Clean, Avery's girlfriend, the singer from the Apollo, eventually moved on. She sang about heartbreak and loss, and people assumed she was singing about a man who had left her. In a way, she was. Lionel Turner's name faded from the gyms and the card games. The younger fighters he had trained asked about him once or twice, but the older men, the ones who knew better, simply shook their heads and changed the subject. The loan shark who had employed him hired someone else, someone quieter, someone who understood that in Harlem, volume was not the same as power. And Bumpy Johnson, the man at the center of it all, went back to his routine. He attended church. He had dinner with friends. He played chess in the park on Sunday afternoons. He was visible, present, a constant reminder that the order of Harlem was intact. But those who knew him well, men like Junie Byard, saw something else. They saw a man who had once again proven that power was not about violence. It was about inevitability. It was about creating a reality where your enemies defeated themselves before they even made a move. The Italian families, who had briefly considered pushing harder into Harlem, pulled back. They focused on their own territories. They respected the boundary, not out of fear alone, but out of recognition that fighting Bumpy Johnson was a losing proposition. The younger crews, the ones from the Bronx and Brooklyn who had thought Harlem was up for grabs, redirected their energy. They found other neighborhoods, other opportunities, and they did so quietly without ever acknowledging why. Harlem had been tested, and Harlem had held. Because Bumpy had held. One evening, months after the disappearances, Bumpy sat on his balcony overlooking Edgecombe Avenue. The city stretched out before him, lights flickering in the distance, the hum of life rising from the streets below. Junie joined him. He poured 2 glasses of cognac and handed one to Bumpy. "You ever think about what happens when you are gone?" Bumpy took a sip. He did not answer right away. He simply looked out at the city, at the kingdom he had built and defended for so many years. "Every day. And I make sure that by the time I am gone, the structure is strong enough to stand without me." Junie nodded. "You think it is?" Bumpy smiled faintly. "Ask me in 10 years. They sat in silence for a while, the city breathing around them, the weight of what they had built settling comfortably on their shoulders. The disappearances had been a message, but the aftermath was the legacy. And legacy, Bumpy knew, was the only thing that truly lasted. Years later, when the story of that night at the Cotton Club was told in barbershops and bars, in pool halls and late-night card games, it was always told the same way. 3 men mocked Bumpy Johnson in public. By sunrise, they were gone. No one knew exactly where they went. No one asked, because in Harlem, some questions did not need answers. The story became legend, a cautionary tale, a reminder that respect was not optional, those words carried weight, and that the wrong words, spoken in the wrong place, could erase you from existence. Bumpy Johnson never confirmed the story. He never denied it either. He simply continued to move through Harlem with the same quiet authority he always had. And every time someone new came to the neighborhood, every time a young hustler thought about making a name for themselves, every time an outsider considered testing the boundaries, someone would pull them aside. And they would tell them the story. About the 3 men who mocked Bumpy in public. about how they vanished before sunrise, and about how, in Harlem, some names were never to be spoken lightly. Bumpy Johnson was one of those names, and it would remain that way long after he was gone. Because legends do not die, they simply become the rules by which everyone else lives. And in Harlem, the rule was simple: respect Bumpy or disappear.